Of course, the big story this week: on December 8th, the Jubilee Year of Mercy officially commenced when Pope Francis opened wide the holy door at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. In addition to the customary papal indulgences normally granted during a holy year, the Pope made two very special provisions. Francis has extended the authority of all priests worldwide to forgive the sin of abortion, and he validated the sacrament of confession celebrated by the Schismatic Society of St. Pius X. How will this holy year play out, and will there be other changes in pastoral practice in light of the recent Synod of Bishops, which intensely focused on the Church's concept of mercy? My first guest joins us to discuss all of it, as well as his new book, A Deeper Vision: The Catholic Intellectual Tradition in the 20th Century. Please welcome one of our esteemed members of the Papal Posse, Editor-in-Chief of thecatholicthing.org, Robert Arroyo. Robert,
great to
see you. Thanks for coming. I want to talk first about this Jubilee year. I mean, you heard it in the introduction. The Pope making these two carve-outs. One, all priests can forgive the sin of abortion, something usually restricted to bishops and confessors at St. Peter's, and this validation of at least the sacrament of confession for members of the Society of Pius X. What is the Pope's thinking on this?
Well, it's hard to say. It just seems that this is a kind of a general extension of mercy and forgiveness to groups that it isn't exactly clear to me have not had this available before, because certainly here in the United States, this is not a great change. Almost every diocese, in my understanding here in the United States, the bishop has already extended to allow priests to forgive the sin of abortion. Now, the extension to a slightly schismatic group is a little bit more of a reach, but those are priests who were ordained illicitly by valid bishops, if invalidly. So they are indeed priests. They are still in the apostolic succession. So this is, I suppose, a way to show that he's extending this even beyond the typical borders. Certainly Benedict XVI had already had negotiations.
Yeah, but it's a curious thing.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, if you're saying, well, this priest, his sacrament is valid in the confessional, is it also valid at the altar? Is it also valid in other respects? Or is it just restricted to confession?
Well, I would have to think that if a priest can validly absolve someone, then that person can approach the Eucharist.
So are they only valid for the year, and then they're no longer valid? I mean, this is where the questions come up.
Right.
So I'm not trying to be cute.
Well, no, as we know, this Pope loves to make gestures and then figure things out later.
As we go down the road,
He gets it moving, and then we'll figure it out.
Well, speaking of gestures and getting things moving, on November 29th, when the Pope was in the Central African Republic, he opened the holy door of a cathedral, and he said, you know what, we're starting the Jubilee year early. So, on November 29th, he sort of tipped his hand for what we saw this week officially happen in Rome. And at the time he said this: those who evangelize must therefore be first and foremost practitioners of forgiveness, specialists in reconciliation, experts in mercy. This is how we can help our brothers and sisters cross to the other side, by showing them the secret of our strength, our hope, and our joy, all of which have their source in God, for they are grounded in the certainty that He is in the boat with us. In light of what we saw at the Synod, in light of what we've been hearing in recent days, what do you think the Pope means by this? Where is he leading the Church in this year of mercy? What does he mean to do?
You're asking me to speculate. I always tell you when you do this that the Bible tells us we should not tell fortunes and not try to predict the future.
Now, wait a minute. So now you believe I'm trying to reduce you to a soothsayer? Is that what you're contending here on the television show?
I don't think we know exactly. There's been a lot of speculation. I was over there for the whole period. And what we have to say is, at the end, the Synod Fathers came up to the edge of that question of communion for the divorced and remarried. They talked a lot about mercy, about synodality, but did not cross over into anything new. And they chose not to vote on the document, the final document as a whole. They voted on each paragraph. And so it's advice to the Holy Father. What he will do going forward is difficult for us to say. But I think what we can say, without entering into soothsaying, is that he wants to give as much of an impression during this year of the mercifulness of God and the way that the church is able to bring that to as many different nooks and crannies of not only the church but the world as possible.
Right. I want to focus on something. We didn't get into this last week, but on the return flight from Africa to Rome, the Pope gave one of his press conferences, and those are always rich occasions for papal sound bites. And he said this about fundamentalism, and I'd like to get your reaction. Fundamentalism is a disease that exists in all religions. In the Catholic Church, we have many, who believe they possess the absolute truth, and they go on sullying others through slander and defamation, and that is wrong. I say this because it is my church. Religious fundamentalism must be combated. It is not religious. God is lacking. It is idolatrous. Now, the setup for this was he was trying to get people to not condemn the entire religion of Islam because of fundamentalists, and then he went on to say, well, look, I've got fundamentalists in my own camp over here. Your reaction?
Well, it's an odd thing to do. I understand it in the context of Islam, but in the plane flight, it's always dangerous when he's at certain altitudes and he begins to talk with the press, because he tends to free associate, and he isn't speaking as precisely as he might in maybe other circumstances. It's one of the characteristic things about Jorge Bergoglio, that he has this fear of fundamentalism, and quite apart from Islam. And we heard him a few weeks ago talking about seminarians who are rigid, and they scare him because they bite.
Right, he avoids them?
Yeah, he avoids them. This must correspond to something in his history, but it clearly doesn't correspond to much of what we here in the United States, and I dare say Catholics in Europe as well, find to be typical. If you go into a parish and if you have a very fundamentalist pastor or curate, it's very rare, actually. So there's something that he's getting at. Maybe, again, this is part of this mercy, that we don't wish to be too rigid. We want to be more personal towards other people. But it's never easy to understand what he means when he refers to that.
Well, I mean, a lot of people were speculating online when this came out, and I had a number of journalists calling me and telling me, who are the Catholic fundamentalists who are igniting themselves in marketplaces, or, training young kids to go out and attack other people of other faith groups. I don't know where those people are. I've never seen that. Yeah, I mean, certainly I've encountered people who are very literate in their faith and doctrinaire. That's different from, someone who's being an aggressor, a violent aggressor, because someone disagrees with him.
He had an experience, a very good experience with an imam in Argentina. He was very close to him, as he was to a Jewish rabbi. Right. And so I think he tends to regard that as the kind of experience, that almost a paradigm for the way that the different faiths should behave towards one another. And so he brings that to Africa, which is a much more difficult situation than Argentina is, of course, and tries to pour a little oil on the waters. But the categories are broad. The Catholic fundamentalism typically doesn't result, as you rightly say, in violence, and it gives rise to a kind of a false moral equivalency that makes people nervous.
Yeah. Let's talk, speaking of nervous, there are a lot of nervous people over this Vatican scandal, part two, that we're watching play out. Some of these journalists and the alleged leakers have been corralled, and they are being tried in the Vatican by a court. Your thoughts on this? The Pope made a reference to the Borgias. There are reports coming out of the trial that the Monsignor who leaked the documents to the female reporter was engaged in some activity, intimate activity with her. Your thoughts?
Yeah, what he said was that she seduced him. And then
blackmailed him.
She blackmailed him. She's actually a member of the Italian Secret Service, and this is typical of Rome and of Italy. There are these stories, wheels within wheels, and now she's shot back that she's happily married, and even if she was going to cheat on her husband, it wouldn't be with a 50-year-old Monsignor, who she also hinted very strongly does not like women.
Oh, boy.
So I think that part of it is just some very nasty, sordid back and forth. I would be very surprised if there's anything to that part of it.
Any concern on your part that the Vatican is targeting journalists and the notion of free inquiry? I mean, the fact is there is good that comes out of some of these things. You look at the Boston situation, I don't see anybody rounding up the Boston Globe. They published leaked information, but I understand going after the leakers in your own in your own institution. I think journalists have a real problem with targeting journalists who are reporting something given by a third party.
Yeah. And it's typical in Rome, as you know, Raymond, that each person in the Vatican has his favorite journalist that he tends to talk to. The Pope himself talks to the editor of La Repubblica and says some things that at times get him in a little bit of hot water. So it's not exactly unknown. I like to say here in Washington we have leaks that are a drip here and there. Yeah. In Rome it's a fire hose. Everybody's got their own people they like to leak to, and it does cross a line, it seems to me, a bit. It's one thing to prosecute people who are working for the Vatican and had I believe sworn to keep certain material discreet and under lock and key. When that has been breached, that is a legitimate thing to pursue. The journalist who receives this information is like a journalist anywhere else. What are they going to do with it? They're obviously going to try to pursue stories that are legitimate stories.
If it's newsworthy and it's an international organization, you got to cover it. I want to play one thing for you. Read this. The Pope talking about the climate change summit in Paris. This has been a focus for years for him. Laudato Si, the big encyclical he rolled out, focused on environmental care and the moral obligation of all of us to be concerned about the environment. But he put a very fine point on it. He said the world needed to come to some climate change agreement to limit emissions. And he said on the plane ride from Africa, we are on the verge of suicide, to use a strong word, and I'm certain that people in Paris are aware of this and want to do something about it. I trust these people will do something. I hope this will be the case, and I pray it will. Any concern about the Pope putting so fine a point that it must be this treaty now or never, he said?
Yeah, and I think that some Vatican figures have talked about this being a transformative moment, that this has to be some sort of significant, profound, radical change in the world. Yes, there is a concern because, look, there's no credible scientist who says that the human race is committing suicide. Let's say that the worst case scenario goes forward. I don't believe that that's going to happen, and I think very few do. The human race will still adapt in some fashion. The difficulty with what the Holy Father has been doing, it seems to me, is that in Laudato Si, the theological vision is very beautiful. The attempt to recover a sense of God's creation as opposed to just sort of the physics of the world that we see in modern science, I think that is utterly needed, and he does it quite beautifully. The problem, even beginning there, is that he tends, when he looks at the actual policy proposals, to look at the most radical policy proposals, and his advisors have tend to come from that part of the environmental movement. I don't think, if we want to look practically speaking, the countries of the world are simply not going to agree to so radical a change because their individual interests just don't allow.
Yeah, no, it's going to be very. The other thing is this enforcement mechanism is going to be very difficult. And I know everyone's been, the United States, parts of Europe, the Pope, they've all been advocating an enforcement mechanism. Who enforces this? Who does it?
As people who are knowledgeable about this subject, as you know, I wrote a whole book about religion and environmentalism about 10 or 15 years ago. And so I've looked very carefully into the science of this and sort of the politics of it. Anybody who's familiar with the facts on the ground knows that the two largest emitters going forward are going to be India and China. Very large populations, yet undeveloped, seeking to bring their people up to a more tolerable level. And a person who cares about the poor has to care about that dimension globally, that dimension of development. Now, that simply means that the types of environmental targets, particularly with relation to CO2 emissions that people are talking about, are not going to be reached and therefore are not going to have the influence. Fortunately, as I believe, fortunately, I don't think that the actual change that CO2 emitted into the environment by human beings is going to have is not going to be as radical as the Pope and others are accepting. So there are things that need to be done, but they won't be done in this radical format that the Vatican has been putting.
But at the heart of this is an idea, And I'll quote the Pope, people are more important than ideas, the Pope is quoted as saying. I think that informs this concern for the environment, concern for the poor. You have a new book, A Deeper Vision, that really explores Catholic thought. Where does Francis fit into the spectrum, and why is this book needed now?
Well, I didn't write A Deeper Vision to respond to what Francis is doing. In fact, it was pretty much done when we were covering the conclave back in 2013, where he was elected. But I think you're right to point to that phrase that he uses quite often. And the paradox is that people are more important than ideas is itself an idea.
Right.
And so we have to understand what that means concretely. Most of the time, when he's speaking about that, I think he speaks out of the Catholic tradition about the human person as being in the image and likeness of God, and therefore of infinite worth, each individual person of individual worth. The difficulty comes in when he either unintentionally gives the impression, or others interpret him to mean, that Catholic truth, that Catholic dogma, that the great development of Catholic culture throughout the millennia don't have anything to tell us what it means to put people first, and why it is, and then how it is that we treat people that respects their human dignity.
Now, well, you spend an enormous amount of time here talking about the articulation of this solid truth, and we see it in the mouths and in the minds of great thinkers. Why do people need to reconnect, do you think, with this trajectory of the 20th century and its intellectual tradition in the Catholic thought and in the Catholic Church?
Well, as we know, the Holy Father has spoken about the Church as being a kind of a field hospital. And what I like to say, and I say this in the book, is that that's an interesting image, and it's true in a way, as long as we understand it in the right way. The field hospital is a good hospital if it does medicine. And if you don't know what the medicine is to help cure people, you're like a doctor who has a good bedside manner, but doesn't know any medical science. So he can hold your hand and make you feel better for a little while, but he can't cure you. Right. He can do what a nice person does, a friend does when he sits down. He's not really a doctor. So the medicinal quality of Catholicism is something that the world cannot offer. That when Christ came into the world, who Christ is, understanding who he is, what the Church is, understanding what the Church is, these are all things that were brilliantly written about. Not only in philosophy and theology and scripture studies, but in my book, as you know, I deal with culture, I deal with literature,
you get
with
into
poetry.
The whole literature
I try to deal
as well.
You know, it was John Paul II who was the first pope to recognize that culture had become a kind of a protagonist in the modern world. And one of the things that I think we have to keep in mind constantly as Catholics is that when thought is regarded as weak, when people don't really believe that systems can explain things, systems like philosophy and theology, they tend to look toward images. So when you get powerful images, whether it's in Gerard Manley Hopkins, the poet, or in Paul Claudel, the French writer, or in novelists like Graham Greene or Evelyn Waugh, these things are quite important in giving a sense of what it is that Catholicism means concretely in the world. So culture is a very complex notion. But what I tried to get at this book for the average reader, I really labored very hard to not make this too technical, but I do want to have some substance of what the greatness of Catholicism was in the 20th century. I think that helps us be those doctors and nurses and that field hospital that can help cure the modern world.
No, there's a great sweep of this tradition that's laid out, and it's in one location, which is, I can't imagine how long did it take you to work on this?
About 4 or 5 years.
Oh my gosh. A Deeper Vision, the Catholic intellectual tradition in the 20th century. It's available at bookstores everywhere and online and through EWTN's religious catalog. It's a fascinating look at our own history and really how to advance it. It sets up how do you advance this going forward. Robert Royal, thank you as always for being here.